and hopefully wrapping up all the different things that we've talked about with classification and evolution into kind of one big picture that you can watch and hopefully get some review before you take your test. So what are we doing today? We're going to do a whale fossil hunt. We're going to look at whale ankles and compare them. We're going to do a whale DNA comparison. And ultimately, we're going to answer questions about whale evolution. Our big question is, how did whales become whales? So let's look at what we've got today. So today we have two major groups of whales. So think classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Remember all of that? So we've got the mysticetes, the baleen whales, and that's kind of like a suborder. So remember, there can be divisions between those. So it's bigger than a family. So there's multiple families in the mysticetes, but it's below the order of the whales. So it's this between group. So we've got the baleen whales, and that is going to include the blue whale, the humpback whale, and the gray whale. And these are all the whales that strain food out of the water with their baleen, like all the krill. Then we've also got the toothed whales. Similarly, this is one of those suborders. And this is the sperm whale, orcas, and dolphins. And yes, orcas and dolphins aren't true whales, but they're still part of this suborder, this odontocete group. So how do we get these? Where did whales come from? Now, Darwin even had some ideas about this. In the first edition of his book, The Origin of Species, there's a quote that says, "I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale." Now, he was wrong about the bear idea. He actually was just talking about ideas and talking about the idea of natural selection. He did not actually have any evidence about this statement, which is why he later removed it from future editions of his book. But he was right about natural selection. This idea that there's a variety of traits in a population that are genetic, and if some of these variations are better than others, that allow you to survive and reproduce better than others, then those are the traits that you're going to find in the next generation. And you can gradually make huge changes. So if we look at a little bit of history, you all made a timeline, so I hope you can see all of the history of the Earth. But if we kind of zoom in just on the Mesozoic, Cenozoic, so about 250 million years ago until now, you can see mammals. And there were mammals throughout dinosaur times, and they really branched out, though, after dinosaurs went extinct. But the earliest mammals were terrestrial. They had legs. Now, whales are mammals. They do not live on land, but they do still have all the mammal characteristics that make you a mammal. They have to breathe air. They give birth to live young. They feed those young milk. They have hairs, or at least bristles. So they are mammals. So earliest mammals evolved with legs. But whales swim. They don't walk on land. So how do we get whales? Where did these whales come from? And what would the earliest whales look like? So to start answering our question, we need to look at the earliest modern whales. So we can look back in fossils. They go back about 23 million years ago to the beginning of the Miocene. So if we made a timeline, we've got now on here, and looking back through time, we can see the Miocene was between 5 million years ago and 23 million years ago. So there's definite fossils of things that absolutely look like whales. But since they absolutely are identifiable as whales, they're great swimmers and they have no walking legs. So we still haven't answered our question about where did whales come from. So we need to start looking for clues in those fossils that will start connecting the whales that we know are whales to some of their ancestors that might not look exactly like whales. So we found some whale-like fossils with strange teeth in the Eocene. And so you can see here highlighted in red is the Eocene, much earlier. So scientists wanted to explore more of this time of the Eocene. Okay, so if we wanted to find Eocene fossils, where should we go? This is when you start to look at the geology of the planet so that you can target where might there be good Eocene fossils. So India did not always touch the rest of the Eurasian plate. So India was a separate landmass about 71 million years ago, and it was slowly moving closer and closer to the Eurasian plate. And between India and the Eurasian plate, there was water. Scientists have named it the Tethys Sea. And India moved north, so you can see 55 million years ago, then 38 million years ago, and it gradually hit Asia. That's what has formed the Himalayas today, the crunching of the India plate into the Eurasian plate. And in addition to the mountains of the Himalayan mountains, we've got the mountains of Pakistan, which are over to the side. So we definitely don't want to go fossil hunting in the Himalayas, where like Mount Everest, too tall, too snowy, too difficult to find good fossils that have not been totally destroyed. So instead, looking over in Pakistan, it's kind of over on the edge, doesn't have all of the mountain building, and instead we'll have some Eocene rocks that had an ocean during the Eocene in Pakistan. Now, maybe you don't want to go visit Pakistan right now. Wouldn't blame you. But back in the 80s, like the 1980s, Pakistan and the United States got along really well. It was a relatively safe place to travel, and so scientists could easily go to Pakistan and study fossils. And there are lots of exposed marine Eocene rocks in the Pakistan mountains. So, great place to look. Yes, for whale fossils, even though it's far away from the ocean right now, but it was ocean back during the Eocene. Sorry, this is one of my cats, and she is going to stand in our Eocene timeline. Scoot over. So, we're going to hunt for some whale fossils. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, and we're going to discover some fossils at the right times, and I'm going to try to put them down on a timeline.
We are going to go on our whale hunt now. If you want to read all of the details, you can follow along in your book on page 85. So our whale hunt is going to involve this time period that we've already identified. We have between 34 million years ago and all the way back to 55 million years ago. So we're going to be concentrating on this Eocene time period. And we're going to look at some of the fossils that had been discovered over the years that fall in this Eocene time range. So for a long time, people have found fossils they've identified as primitive whales, like this fossil here. So here we've got a picture of the fossil, a little close-up of the skull, and an artist's representation of what that fossil looks like. So some examples of the animals in this kind of age, these are things like Durodon. And we have dated these rocks so that they're somewhere between 25 and 45 million years old. So we're going to put this kind of right in the middle at 36 million years. So I'm going to put it up here. It's kind of up here at the beginning or the most recent part of the Eocene. So, primitive whale. Now, they've also found fossils from much earlier that have some similarities to some of those fossils, some of those primitive whale fossils. And interestingly enough, the fossils that they've found that have some similarities look kind of like this wolf-like creature called a mesonychid. And this was our goal. We want to try to find how whales connect back with a land animal that would walk on 4 feet, so mesonychids would. And there are some features about the skull, especially the inner ear, that connects it to our primitive whales. But one of the interesting things about the mesonychids, like Synonyx or Pachyhyena, is that these creatures had tiny hooves on every single one of their toes, which is very different from wolves today, because these are not true wolves. These are a different group called mesonychids, and these existed somewhere around 55 million years ago. So I'm going to put that here on my timeline. So for a number of years, this was the picture that we had. We had primitive whales, and then a big gap, and then we had these mesonychids that were tied to those primitive whales by some of those skull features. So this was the picture until 1983, and that's when a man named Philip Gingrich went to Pakistan and discovered some more fossils. And he found this fossil of this Pakicetus, and it has whale-like features. In fact, maybe you can see the skull has the nostrils farther up, but based on the fossils, it's still a 4-legged animal. But this was dated. They figured out how old this was to about 50 million years. So we're going to add that to our timeline, 50 million years. So that fills in our gap a little bit, but we've still got gaps. Okay, so Philip Gingrich went back out into the field. 1990, he found another fossil. This time this was in Egypt. And this was of Basilosaurus. Basilosaurus was very long, so I don't know if you can see the scale here. That says 500 centimeters. So this was well over 1,000 centimeters. But its little hind legs, that says 10 centimeters. So it was this giant body with teeny tiny little back legs. And this fossil was about 37 million years old. So that's going to go up here. So has a little bit of a back leg, but definitely not functional back legs because they're so tiny. But it begins to fill in our gap a little bit, but still not anywhere close to 4 legs like this. So we've still got a pretty decent gap. Then in 1994, again, Philip Gingrich found another set of fossils. And this is called Rhodocetus. And in Rhodocetus, I'm not sure you can really see, I'll zoom in a little bit more. Rhodocetus had well-defined hip bones that would connect to hind legs. So that suggests that in Rhodocetus, the hind legs actually did something. And Rhodocetus was about 46 million years old, so we'll put that right there. So this was the picture in the mid-1990s, and maybe you'll notice there's a critical gap here. Even though we've gotten bigger back legs, more functional, we've still got a pretty big jump from Rhodocetus here back to Pakicetus with 4 legs. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to think. If you went maybe to Pakistan, where there were lots of Eocene fossils, and you were able to find some whale relatives that were in this time range, what do you think the fossils would look like? Think about the back legs, think about the skull, think about any of the features that you would expect in fossils from this time period. So one of Philip Gingrich's students actually did that. He went to Pakistan, he found some more bones and fossils, and this is the fossil that he found that dates to 48 million years old in some of the mountains of Pakistan. And I want you to look, much longer back legs, but still flipper-like feet. The skull, though, is streamlined. It's having the nostrils up on top. So it is definitely this mix. So if we place it, it said 48, so there was 45, 46, 47, right about there, 48. You can see that it bridges this gap really nicely between something that had little back legs to something that had fully functional back legs here. So this is a nice transitional fossil showing going from a land mammal to a water mammal.
All right, so now that we've seen our fossils in our fossil timeline, let's talk about some of these questions. These are the questions from page 87, but you don't need to turn these in. There's going to be some Edpuzzle questions that you'll just answer, and that's what I'll grade. So, can we make predictions about past events? We can totally make predictions about past events. You all just made a prediction not that long ago, and you were able to test it by finding another fossil. That's what paleontologists do. That's the way they do their research. They will make predictions and then look in areas that would have that age of fossil and see what they find to see if their predictions were supported. Now, as we did this timeline activity, each new fossil filled a gap. But how many new gaps were formed? So we had a huge timeline, and at first we just had something at the beginning and something at the end. We had a very large gap between them. But then when we found another fossil inside of that gap, really we made 2 gaps out of that 1 gap. So why is the absence of transitional fossils not a fair argument against evolution? Because are we ever going to fill in all of the gaps? No, that's totally unreasonable, because we're not going to be able to get down to every single gap totally filled in, because every gap that we fill in, we really make more gaps. They're smaller gaps, but there are more gaps every time. Why is it unlikely that these fossils are the direct ancestors of whales? It's because that the way evolution works is not just in a straight line. It's really in a big bushy pattern. So we might be seeing cousins instead of the direct ancestors of some of these whales. So I already answered the next question. How are they probably related to those direct ancestors? They're probably cousins. So what's wrong with that missing link concept of evolution? That, oh, if we could just find, every link in the chain, it's because it's not even a chain. It's a tree. So evolution is really the tree of life and not an orderly step-by-step lineage. Now, an interesting fact, says several species of modern whales have well-developed rear limbs while they're embryos. As the embryo continues to mature, these limbs atrophy. They shrink and they become non-functional. Why do you suppose this happens? Why do the limbs form? And then why do they atrophy? What do you think? So these limbs form because their ancestors had limbs. They had back legs when they were land walking mammals. That information is still in their DNA, and the limbs can still form, and then something else will happen that will take them away as embryos. So our picture in 1994 from when they discovered that fossil in that gap that we saw shows that there were some common ancestor, sort of like a Mesonychid, and then the Mesonychids branched off. They ended up going extinct. But the branch that led to the whales has now branched into the whales that we see today, and they are still extant. They are still living today. Now, let's come back to that idea of whales and losing their back legs. Why have whales lost their back legs? We even said that some embryos have the back legs. Why do they go away? It isn't just because they don't use them. That is a Lamarck explanation. Do you all remember Lamarck? So Lamarck was one of the other scientists that lived about the time of Darwin, actually a little earlier than Darwin. And Lamarck said that organisms acquire characteristics. So they have a characteristic that if they use it, then it gets bigger. And if they don't use it, then it goes away. But that did not have data to back it up because they aren't inheriting those traits. Just like if I had braces, which I did, it doesn't mean that my kids, like Joshua here, is not going to need braces. He very well might need braces. Just because I have straight teeth from braces doesn't mean he's going to have straight teeth, because that is not an inherited characteristic. We can't acquire traits and then pass them on to our children. Another example, there are dogs that get their tails docked. Just because a mom dog has had her tail docked doesn't mean her babies aren't going to have long tails. In fact, that's something you have to do for every generation of puppies. So we need to have a better explanation about why whales lose their back legs. We can't just say, oh, they don't need them, they're going to go away. So we need to have some way that not having legs is beneficial. So does the amount of energy an animal spends affect its evolutionary fitness? Said another way, how does having legs affect something as basic as body temperature? Remember, these whales are swimming all of their life in water. Would whales with legs have a harder time maintaining their body temperature, which would mean they would need to eat more food and expend more energy? So let's do an experiment. So there are whales that are warm-blooded, and they are spending their entire life in the water, and some of them are even in the Arctic. We want to do an experiment to see, would having no legs be beneficial? So in our experiment, if we were together, this is what we would do. We would have two gloves, and one glove, I've just knotted all of the fingers. So maybe you can see, I put knots in all of the little fingers and flipped it inside out. So this glove is like a whale with no legs. The other glove is just a regular glove. It still has legs. We could then put warm water in each of our gloves these would be our little whale bodies. And we would put warm water in our whale bodies, and then we would put them in cold water for the ocean. And then we could measure to see which glove has the water cool off quicker. So right now, make a prediction. Which glove do you think the water would cool off quicker in? So water would be inside the gloves. We would put them in cold ocean. We would watch to see which glove has the water cool off quicker. So you made your prediction. If we had actually gotten to carry this out, you would see that the glove with legs cools off quicker than the glove without legs. Why? More surface area. The ones with legs have more surface area, so they lose their warmth faster. So if we had whales that some of them had slightly longer legs, some had slightly shorter legs, and if the legs aren't giving them any benefit and only being a hindrance, then maybe the whales that had shorter legs would survive better, pass those traits on to their offspring. Their offspring would have shorter legs, and there might be a variety, so there'd be variation in the population. And then the ones with shorter legs would again survive better, pass that trait on, and so on. All right, so we've gotten some explanation about legs, leg lengths, and maybe that these whales are related to these mesonychids, but the mesonychids are extinct. What if we wanted to know the closest living relatives of whales? Now remember, those mesonychids had hooves. Even those, that transitional fossil that we found mentioned it had hooves on all of its feet. So maybe we should look at the hooved mammals. So there are two orders of hooved mammals. There's the perissodactyls and the artiodactyls. So to show what these all are, perissodactyls include things like horses and zebras and rhinos and tapirs. Artiodactyls include deer and camels and sheep and cows and hippos and pigs and giraffes. So let's talk a minute about leg anatomy so that we can compare different organisms. If you want to see some of these pictures more up close, we're on page 91 in your book. And we can look specifically at the heels of different organisms. Now, the heels might be in slightly different places. In humans, we are flat feet walkers, so our heel is where your heel is. But horses are toe walkers, so their heel is much farther up. What looks like a horse's knee is really their ankle, which is why it bends the opposite way of your knee, because it's not their knee, it's their ankle. Their knee is much higher up, closer to their body. So if we find ankle bones, we can start comparing ankle bones. So we can find ankle bones in lots of different organisms. And we can look at horses and pigs, and then we can compare these ankles. So here we've got a bunch of different pictures of ankles. We've got pigs from today. We've got mesonychids. We've got other primitive perissodactyls and primitive artiodactyls. And we have Pakicetus. Pakicetus is our whale. Okay, it's one of those ancient whales that still had a leg that was big enough that we could find an ankle. So let's compare these. And we want to look at the shape of each of these ankles. I'll even give you a clue. That. So the primitive perissodactyls and the mesonychids both have a big ridge down here. Compare that to the primitive artiodactyl. That is two small ridges. The pig today also has two small ridges. Check out Pakicetus. Which organisms are Pakicetus most similar to? Hopefully you see that Pakicetus is most similar to the pigs and the artiodactyls. So that means that the whales are more similar to the artiodactyls than the mesonychids. So now we have a new picture. So this was developed in 2001, that the mesonychids with their ankle with one big ridge, the artiodactyls branched off, and then the whales branched off of that, because the whales are more closely related to the artiodactyls than to the perissodactyls and the mesonychids. All right, but what if we wanted to know which artiodactyls? Now we can look at DNA. Now we're really just going to skim through this instead of doing the whole activity. But we could totally compare DNA. Now you've got all these strips of DNA in your book. We could totally cut them out. We could totally arrange them so that we could compare them. So here we've got a strip of DNA from right whales, a strip of DNA from cows, which is a type of artiodactyl, and we could totally compare them. And when we compared, we would put them right on top of each other. We would then look to see where are the letters different, and we could get a count for how many letters are different. There's a chart. It was on page 92. We could fill it in. Okay, I'm skimming through this. Don't even worry about writing all these numbers down. Let's skip to the analysis. So if we organized our groups based on how many differences there are, the ones with fewer than 5 differences, we had porpoise and a sperm whale, porpoise and right whale, sperm whale and right whale. So you can see all the numbers of differences and which groups had those differences. So we have one set of groups here. So our first question under this on page 93 says, notice all of the pairings. So we've got 4 species that are all equally related, about porpoise, sperm whale, right whale, and hippo. Then we've got 3 species that are all about equally related, the giraffe, the deer, and the cow. What do these low numbers suggest about how closely they are related to each other? These have very few differences. How closely related are they? All right, then we start looking at other pairings. Pigs and peccaries have 7 differences. What does that suggest about how closely they are related to each other? Then we could keep going. Hopefully you're seeing that the higher the numbers, the more distantly related things are. So the lower the numbers, the closer related. The higher the numbers, the more distantly related. So once we do all of our pairings, we had the porpoise, the sperm whale, the right whale, and the hippo. They were all pretty similar in numbers. The giraffe, the cow, and the deer, all pretty similar in numbers. The pig and the peccary. And then we've got camel and rhino. Those had the highest number of differences. So if we were to draw a cladogram, we would group these sets close together and the other branches farther back. Remember, cladograms are going to show time. This one, I had to draw it sideways because I couldn't fit it up and down. So earliest would be to the left and most recent is to the right instead of top and down like we did earlier. So you can see that these organisms were more closely related, and then the ancestor between like porpoises and cows is less closely related. It's farther back in the past. But even farther back in the past is the common ancestor of rhinos and porpoises. So another fancier looking cladogram, including even more information about some of those ancient whales. You can see all of their connections. And ultimately, if you look at our branches, so here's all of mammals, there's the mesonychids that branch off, the artiodactyls, and what is the closest relative of whales that is still alive? Check it out. Look at that hippo right there. So a quick recap. The fossil teeth linked the whales to the mesonychids that were four-legged. The tiny hooves clued us in that whales are related to the ungulates, those hooved mammals. The ankle bones tied us into the artiodactyls of the two orders of ungulates. Then the DNA confirmed the artiodactyls and pointed to the hippos as the closest cousins of whales. So all of these different lines of evidence, DNA and fossil evidence and current ankle bones like anatomy evidence, all of those different lines of evidence point to the same answer. So that gives us an even stronger piece of evidence that there is a relationship between whales and artiodactyls, and specifically, whales' closest cousins are hippos. So hopefully you got a little review of all the different evolution, and you now have a better understanding of whales' evolution.